Hello, good evening, everyone. We're gonna do our usual. We'll give folks about 30 seconds or so to make their way into the room and log in here, but thank you all for joining. Excellent. We're just gonna give about 15 seconds or more. Appreciate everybody taking the time out of their evening to join us. See a lot of familiar names, so thank you all for continuing to join throughout our series of events. Excellent. So we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's a few more people we're expecting, but folks will stream in as we come into the room. Good to see everybody again. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we'll go ahead and get started with the session. As you all know, my name's Anthony. I'm the director. Today's session, we're going to talk a little bit more about international law at Emory and this particular International Humanitarian Law Clinic and the opportunities that you'll have there. We've got some prepared questions that we're going to talk through with the professor here, and then we're going to open the floor to all of your questions. We'll be on here till about 6:45, so we've got about 45 minutes to have your questions answered and run through. So hopefully we'll get through. If you do have questions, you can use the chat box or the question and answer function. Please feel free to go ahead and submit your questions in there. We'll be able to call on you and unmute you and get you in front of the professor here to ask your questions. But we're about to wrap up this virtual series of events, so we appreciate everybody hanging around. I'm assuming you're joining tonight because you've got some interest in international law, so hopefully it'll be informative. We'll wrap up our series tomorrow with the question and answer session with the dean. So join us tomorrow at noon if you want to have some FaceTime with the dean of the law school. And that'll be our wrap-up ceremony as well before we head for our big in-person visiting day. So we hope to see you all on Friday, get a chance to visit campus, talk with some professors, and look at the school as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. This evening, we're extremely lucky to be joined by Professor Laurie Blank, who is one of our professors here and the director of the International Humanitarian Law Clinic. Professor Blank received her Juris Doctor from NYU. She also received a Master's in International Relations from Hopkins and her Bachelor's from Princeton University. Before joining Emory, she did work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, working on international humanitarian law. So, like I said, we're extremely lucky to have her and super excited to have her join us tonight and talk a little bit more about international law and all that we have to offer here at Emory. So we'll go ahead and get started. Professor Blank, if you want to maybe just introduce yourself a little bit further and maybe just give a brief overview of kind of the center and the clinic and the type of work that you all do.
Sure. Well, welcome everyone, and congratulations on being admitted to Emory Law, and I'm glad to see you here thinking about international law issues. So we are watching in real time around the world why international law matters. If you're here, it's because you're already interested in it, but I'm sure current events are ratifying that interest for you, as unfortunate as it is to have this type of event pique our interest. So I teach a range of classes in the international law and national security law space. I direct our Center for International and Comparative Law, and I direct the International Humanitarian Law Clinic, which I founded 15 years ago now. So I teach international law, I teach national security law. I have taught in the past transitional justice and a few other assorted classes. The Center for International and Comparative Law is really a gathering place for folks with interest in international law. We bring in speakers, we have events. Pre-COVID, we had obviously lots more in person. I'm looking forward to kind of restarting and rejuvenating our physically in-person activities a lot more going forward. But we have been able to do some fun online things as well over the last couple of years. So we have it's really aimed at both students and faculty and outsiders. The International Humanitarian Law Clinic is one of our legal clinics here at the law school. Some of you may have learned about some of these already. A law clinic is an experiential learning opportunity. What that means is that you learn by actually doing law as opposed to more classroom oriented learning. So you might represent an indigent defendant. In our juvenile defender clinic, you might represent kids who are facing different legal issues. We have an environmental law clinic. The International Humanitarian Law Clinic focuses on the law that applies during wartime. That's what international humanitarian law is. It's otherwise called the law of war or the law of armed conflict. All the reporting that you're seeing from Ukraine, all the discussions of war crimes and other horrific things, that's all within international humanitarian law. So in the clinic, students have an opportunity to provide assistance to organizations around the world, both here in the US and abroad, that are working on international law issues in armed conflict. Those might be NGOs, non-governmental organizations focused on, for example, protection of civilians in armed conflict. It might be offices at the State Department in Washington, D.C. It might be an international tribunal. We've worked with some of those in the past. We work with the US military. So we have a range of different relationships there, and students working under my supervision and guidance work to provide essentially whatever they need in terms of assistance, research, drafting memos, you name it, essentially the type of work you would do as a young attorney in one of those offices. So we have a lot of fun. It's very au courant. It's what's happening in the news. It's what these organizations are working on at a given moment. So I guess that's a not that quick summary of what we have going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll get into it a bit more as we have this conversation. So like I mentioned, we're going to start with a few prepared questions just to warm up a little bit. I know you all have plenty of questions, so please send those in as we're talking. And we'll get to those in just a few minutes as we go through this. So please keep your questions coming in. Don't be shy. This is really your opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. But Professor Blank, I thought it'd be good to start with the question that a lot of these students are wrestling with right now. So if you could kind of go back to your pre-law school days, your 0L, and kind of go back to your decision process of choosing law school and what you were doing. What was it that ended up bringing you to law school, and what was it that ended up sparking the interest within the international humanitarian sphere?
So I'll try to keep this short. I tell this story a lot, but I find that I sometimes don't keep it as short as I could. But so I went to college, obviously in the previous millennium. It was still the Cold War when I was in college, and so the world was basically situated around two major alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. You may have noticed that we seem to be returning to this type of environment. I have been known to slip and refer to Russia as the Soviet Union more times than I can count in recent years. That's because if you're my age, the enemy in every movie and every book was the Soviet Union. So it's hard to sometimes drop that. But that's what I was really interested in, what we would call collective security, which is how states can get together and form institutions to enhance and maintain and preserve security within the international system. Current events show why that is so important. And that's what I was primarily interested in, the United Nations and similar organizations. I realized as I was finishing college and thinking about, well, what am I going to go study next? Because I knew I needed some more school. I thought to myself, well, the best way to work in this area seems to be a lawyer. I need, even if I don't have a job that's called lawyer, I need to understand the law, because that's the framing of this entire enterprise. There are rules, there are norms, there are frameworks. So I think I need a law degree. And I also said, but I really love international relations, so I'm going to do both. Because apparently 4 years of college was not enough. So I first went and did my master's degree in international relations. And I actually focused on international law and institutions at that degree. So I had a lot of grounding in the international law sphere. And I went to law school after that. I had deferred law school 2 years, so I kind of had that 5 years planned out. And in law school, I had the great fortune to be awarded a research fellowship with a professor who was one of the world's leading experts in the area of international humanitarian law and international human rights. And the research fellowship consisted primarily of being a research assistant for this professor. And I also had to do some of my own writing. I'm telling you sort of all of this to get into how I ended up in the field of international humanitarian law, looking at the law during wartime, because I want you to think about sort of the serendipitous ways that we get excited about a topic, the way we sometimes just kind of stick our foot into an open door and you don't know where you're going to go or why, but that's what school is all about. So I tell this part to encourage you to follow the things that excite you, and you have plenty of time when you get a real job and have to be a real grown-up, or at least masquerade as one, to do what you have to do. So I show up for the first day of my research fellowship, and the professor says to me that I'm going to be helping him. He's working on a book on Shakespeare and the law of war. Some of you probably have a look on your face that was on my face at the time, which is sort of, huh? Shakespeare and the law of war. And I did what any student would do, and I put a big smile on my face and I said, great, that sounds fantastic. Well, needless to say, it absolutely was so fascinating that however many years later, I am still deeply engaged in this topic. It turns out, those of you who studied Shakespeare will already know there's a war in every Shakespeare play, and Shakespeare knew his law. And so therefore, every scene that dealt with something happening in the war and who did what to whom and who was right or who was wrong was actually based on what the law was at the time. So I spent my days diving into the treatises of the 14 and 1500s, seeing what the law was at the time, reading scenes from Shakespeare, and seeing if Shakespeare followed what the law was at the time. It was really, really fun. And by far the best part of law school. Classes were great, but this was like really fun detective work. And so I got really hooked in this area. And then I was very lucky to have an opportunity a year after law school to go work at an organization in Washington, D.C. called the United States Institute of Peace, which is an independent federal research institution. Sounds strange, but it is established by Congress, funded entirely through the appropriations process, and yet the government can't tell it what to do. It's designed, its task is to promote research, education, and training on the peaceful resolution of conflict. The idea being that we put a lot of money into fighting and winning wars, and maybe we can put a small amount of our effort into how do we maintain peace, how do we resolve conflict, and how do we promote those efforts. And I worked on international humanitarian law issues, something called transitional justice, which is how countries emerge from conflict and repression and seek justice and accountability and reconciliation in those difficult times. And I've been working in those areas ever since, and I haven't gotten bored yet. So there's my hopefully not too long story.
No, that's fantastic and definitely a new way to look at Shakespeare as well. So
There you go.
appreciate the insight. So I'm gonna just ask one more question and then we'll start moving on to the student questions. But um, go switching back to Emory and now your work here with the center and with the clinic. What do you see as the vision and mission of the center and the clinic? Moving forward now. Obviously, you all are super busy right now and going on there. Do you see that mission and vision changing, or what do you have in store for the center and the clinic over the next say 5 to 10 years?
So the clinic is going to continue doing the same work that we've been doing, and we have essentially two parallel goals all the time. One is to give students an opportunity to see what it's like to do work in the international law space. In our case, specifically in the space of international law and armed conflict. International law is an area where it can be difficult for students to grasp, to sort of imagine, well, what would a job be? Like, I know what it might look like to work at a law firm or to go into court and prosecute people or defend people, but what's the job in international law? It's a bit hard to get your hands around. And so that's one reason that I started the clinic, was to give students an opportunity to kind of see what that would be by doing some of it. So that's one piece. And the second, obviously, is the way we can provide a service to the community. And it's not the local community, it's the broader community working in this area by providing assistance. Almost any organization or office, whether it's non-governmental or governmental, does not have enough people or time to do the work in what is a critical area. It's really about life and death, and the protection of people. So if we can, whatever assistance we can provide, we're contributing in that sense to that broader effort that I believe in very strongly. So the clinic will continue to marry those two goals. The center, we're always building and thinking about new activities, new synergies. The goal of the Center for International and Comparative Law is to really be an intellectual home for students who are interested in international and comparative law, to be able to participate in events, to hear from speakers who come from outside the law school, to learn about different things that are going on, to engage in research where those opportunities arise. So we're always just, building and creating ways for more engagement, for more opportunity for students to really kind of touch and grab onto these areas.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's all super important. And your first piece actually dovetails very nicely with a question that we had come in from Sam. So I'm gonna cue Sam up to talk a little bit about his question. But Sam, good to see you. You should be able to unmute yourself now. But if you want to introduce yourself real quick, and then the floor is all yours to ask a question for the professor.
Yeah, sure. So funny enough, I had actually sent you an email, I think last night. So nice to be on here again with you. Yeah, I'm currently an admitted student, kind of trying to learn about the opportunities that Emory offers, particularly in public international law. So I had two questions that I'd sent in the chat. One of which is, what does Emory Law do to connect students to career opportunities after graduating? And does Emory Law have strong connections to public international law agencies and opportunities, outside of the Atlanta area? It would be kind of like a question for me. And also, what opportunities are available for students interested in public international law during law school, whether that be externships or otherwise? And again, the question being, are there opportunities that are on campus, and what will those be? And also, are opportunities available in DC, abroad, et cetera?
Sure, these are all great questions. Let me start with things at Emory. So we can kind of organize a bit by coursework, by experiential, by activities, and so on. So we have obviously a number of courses in the public international law space. Those are available on a regular basis. For example, international law is every semester, but most other classes are taught at least every year so that students have multiple opportunities to take the classes that interest them. So classes is one area, whether it's international human rights law, international environmental law, international criminal law, international negotiations, all a range of things like that. Then we have, in addition to the International Humanitarian Law Clinic, which is in the experiential space. So it's a class that you get credit for, but again, it's an experiential learning opportunity. We have another similar class called Human Rights Advocacy, taught by my colleague, Professor Ludson, and students in that class also work with outside organizations on both international and domestic human rights issues, again, working on projects that those organizations have requested assistance on. So that class is another great opportunity to really engage with folks sort of on the front line, so to speak, see what they're working on, make a contribution. We have often also had a similar practicum on transitional justice. That's not offered every year, but it's kind of offered depending on need. We've had similar in the national security and counterterrorism space. So there's a variety of opportunities within the academic credit environment to be working outside the classroom, but still within Emory. The next area is there's our international law journal, the Emory International Law Review. So students who are interested in being on a journal can kind of get deeply engaged into an international law topic. That's another avenue. We also have a moot court team, actually two that focus on international law. One is called the Jessup International Moot Court, which is sort of the largest international law moot court. It's really fun. And we also have an international criminal court moot court team that competes as well. So those are great opportunities to kind of, hone your skills in thinking about advocacy in these areas as well. Then there are student organizations. So there's an International Law Society. There is the National Security and Military Law Society. There's an International Arbitration Society. There's an Immigration Law Society, which kind of covers a bit between both domestic and international. And then there are a variety of student groups that are affinity groups, basically, students with an interest in particular regional areas, whether it's Middle East and North Africa or South Asia, et cetera. So those student organizations will have events that are focused on the areas of their interest. So the International Law Society, about 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, had an event on cyber and international law. The Emory International Law Review held its symposium 2 weeks ago, maybe 1 week ago, and it was looking at questions of data and data protection in international law. It was a lot of interesting topics there. So there's a lot happening in that space. It's really valuable to engage with other students who are interested in these areas because, first of all, you have shared common interests, so that's just nice. But you really get a chance to learn from each other. What classes are interesting, what internships are you looking at? You just kind of get that ability to bounce ideas around. Now, if we kind of expand out a little bit, at the broader university, there's a human rights certificate, which is an interdisciplinary certificate that law students are able to participate in, and students take a variety of classes. And I'm not sure if you can find it through the law school's website, but it is possible somewhere online to find the information about sort of what are the requirements. But it's a really neat way to engage in an interdisciplinary space on whether it's human rights and related issues. So that's another interesting thing to look at. The Carter Center is, of course, not far from Emory, and a regular friend and partner of the university and the law school. They do have internships in a variety of aspects of their work, whether it's democratization or rule of law or peace negotiations and so on. So it's a great idea to look and see what they have as summer internships, as opportunities to intern during the school year. There's in Atlanta a lot of work in the immigration space, and unfortunately in the human trafficking space. So those are, again, kind of cross-pollinated across the domestic and the international law space, but obviously deeply rooted in human rights questions. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities there. In terms of Emory-sponsored internships outside of Atlanta, we don't have any specific sort of Emory-sponsored things, but all of us on the faculty and folks in the career office are, regularly engaged in talking with students and providing advice and making connections with folks that we know elsewhere and organizations that we know. So there's lots of sort of opportunities to build networks and relationships, which is a big part of working in this area. So, lots of different opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, Sam. Next, we're going to go over to Sophia. I think she has a pretty interesting question. Sophia, good to see you, and thanks for joining tonight. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Blank, for being here. So I'm a major in international relations currently, and in a lot of my courses, I'm exposed to debates about how international law doesn't actually work. International human rights law it's not actually something that we can be using to ensure like dignity of human rights and people can be protected. So I don't know, perhaps you've heard these debates before, or if you have heard them, like what is your response to them? Because I know I'm definitely wanting to pursue a career in this kind of space. But I obviously political scientists and lots of people want to research and debate the issue. So what is your response to that?
Yeah, great question. So my one way to address the question more broadly, international law, it's not really law. Does it work? Why do I have to care about it? Well, nobody says you have to care about it, obviously, but except my children, obviously they're required to care about it. But there's so many ways that none of us think about where international law is making things possible. So if I were to ask you, for example, if you've ever traveled to another country, international law made that possible. It made it possible for you to take a passport and enter another country and know that, you could get in according to rules and that you could leave and so on. That if for some reason you got into trouble, which you of course never would, but let's just imagine someone were to get into trouble, that you would be able to access and meet with, the consular representatives from your country, because that's required under international law. That's not just whether the whim of the police in that country decide to do that. If you've mailed a letter anywhere outside the United States, international law makes that possible. We have something called the Universal Postal Union. Literally, there's a whole treaty to make sure that letters actually get where they're supposed to go. If you've ever flown an airplane into some, not you personally, but if you've flown on an airplane to another country, there are treaties that provide for civil aviation, all these things, right, that we take for granted. International law makes them all possible. When we see moments like now, when we see a major power, a member of the United Nations Security Council, flagrantly thumbing its nose at international law, at basic ideas of human decency and human dignity, committing atrocities, committing aggression, it's difficult to not feel frustrated about it, for sure. And on some level, I said all that other stuff first because we want to remember that when people say, international law doesn't work, look at what Russia's doing, they're throwing the hardest problem in international law out as like to suggest that the entire enterprise is unworkable, unworthy, etc. It's an effective technique to argue, but I think it's it's, I don't know, I don't want to say it's unfair. I just think it's not seeing the whole picture. The other thing that I would say specifically with respect to the situation right now is we're watching international law at work. I wish I could show you guys a picture, but about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we always talk about the news at the beginning of my classes because they're so tied into what's happening. And we started talking about what was happening in Ukraine. And as my students were shouting out different things that were happening, I started writing on the board, like access to the Black Sea through the Turkish Straits and providing arms to Ukraine and the International Criminal Court. And I ended up with 4 columns all over the board. And all of a sudden I looked at it and I said to all of them, I said, anybody who asks you why you're studying international law, take a picture of that and just show them that picture. I didn't mean to do that, but it was like for me, it was kind of this moving moment of, yeah, this matters, right? What Ukraine has done is bring the whole world along with it to reinforce norms that you can't shoot people in the street because you don't like what they're like, you don't agree with their government, that you want to take their territory over. Nobody is out there saying that what Russia is doing is okay. We may be struggling to stop them, but there is universal agreement, with the exception of a few countries that can't quite seem to get on board. But out of 200 whatever countries, 195 of them, so pretty universal, agree it is wrong. It is unlawful. It is criminal. And so I think that matters. We'll get accountability. It might be slow, it might be partial, but there's no debate about whether or not this is lawful. So it's not an easy field. You have to be an optimist, I think, or be willing to just deal with the fact that not everything is smooth and things aren't tidy, but protecting people from either abuses by their own government or from atrocities is pretty motivating. So I guess I will leave it at that.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Sophia. Good to see you. Excellent. So I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So we'll run through those. So we're going to bring up Lauren right now. She had a good question about bringing it back to Emory in the clinic and the 1L experience. And then we'll wrap up with a question from Fred, who had a more fun-based question. So Lauren, good to see you. The floor is yours if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One's more of a general question, one specific. How should 1Ls be involved with the international and comparative law community? And are there opportunities for foreign language study as a law student, and would you recommend them?
So for 1Ls, I would recommend that you join any of the societies, whether it's the ones I mentioned or other ones that grab your interest. it's a way to learn about events that are happening and talk to students who are a year or two ahead of you and see what classes are, have been fun or interesting or useful, and learn about internship opportunities, learn about lots of things. So I would recommend right away, join, if you're interested in international law, join the International Law Society, join any others, and you immediately enter into a community. So that's one thing. You can, as far as foreign language, there are students who take, it's not common just because students have lots of different things they want to do, but there are students who take foreign language. Obviously, it's at the main university. I don't know the specifics. Maybe Anthony does, but there is an opening to take some credits that are not at the law school. It's limited, obviously, but it is possible. Would I recommend it? It's honestly based on how much you are interested and motivated to learn a foreign language. I think language skills for anybody in today's world are extremely useful. I wish I had better language skills, but it's very much a matter of personal choice.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lauren. So we'll go to our final question now. Let me get Fred up here. Hang on one sec. All right, Fred, you should be able to unmute yourself. Good to see you again. I know you've been through a couple of these, so always glad to have you. And go ahead and ask your question. You got a more fun one.
So when you were talking about Shakespeare and the law, I couldn't help but get curious. And so I kind of have a sort of, my first question would be, what would be the worst war crime, or at least the most interesting war crime in one of these Shakespeare plays that he mentions? And then secondly, I guess just what's your favorite? My favorite play is Merchant of Venice. So if you have anything from that, would be especially interesting. But otherwise, I'd love to hear your response.
Well, you're testing my memory because I haven't looked at anything to do with Shakespeare and the Law of War since 1998. So I'm not sure I can give you a good answer. I thought maybe I would have one of the books here, but I can recommend the two books that the professor that I worked for wrote in this area, which I'm pretty sure are the only two. And then I'll see if I come up with an answer. The first one is called Henry's Wars and Shakespeare's Laws, and it's about Henry V in particular. So if you are, those of you who have read or seen Henry V, you may remember there's a famous scene where he orders killing all the French prisoners of war, and there's a debate among his underlings, can you do this, etc. I'll give you a spoiler that under the law of war, you cannot kill your prisoners. So that kind of sparked the professor that I worked for to pursue in this area. And then, gosh, now I'm trying to remember the name of the second book, which is the one that I worked on. And I can't remember the name of it. I'm sorry. But his name is Theodore Meron, M-E-R-O-N. And I just can't remember the name of that book because that's what happens over time. But I'll tell you some interesting things. So for example, and I may not get the facts correct because again, it's been a long time, but I remember looking at things like Joan of Arc when she was taken into custody and they were going to execute her. She argued that she should be certainly given leniency, released, because she argued that she was pregnant. And therefore, of a vulnerable class, not just a woman, but she was pregnant and therefore couldn't be mistreated, certainly couldn't be executed. Well, that then led me to go research what was the law at the time, not the law today, but what would have Shakespeare understood the law to be regarding the treatment of women during war, regarding the treatment of pregnant women. Let me think about there's a lot in Shakespeare about the ransom of knights, about oaths and the reliability. We even see a real sort of preface to the modern law in the different treatment of another sovereigns. I mean, they weren't states at the time, but they were dukedoms and kingdoms and empires. So another sovereign entity's soldiers were treated in one way as equal belligerents, but when there was an internal rebellion, like in the play Richard III, those rebels were not treated with the same respect because they were treated as criminals. I think I've completely exhausted anything in my memory to do with Shakespeare, but but let me, not Shakespeare, but I'll just throw out to you the Iliad probably is the greatest war epic ever written, and you can find in there, in fact, in Shakespeare's, what's the play? Anyway, I can't remember, but there's a play and Shakespeare talks about Hector dragging Achilles' body, and he's quite condemnatory of that because that was not proper under the law. You don't treat a dead body with disrespect. So that's what I can remember. That was a good memory test for me, so I appreciate that.
Thank you very much for answering. I appreciated that. Hope you have a great evening.
Thanks.
Excellent. Yes, that was very admirable. So thought that was a nice way to end it. Kind of brought us full circle on the classics. Excellent. So I do want to be respectful of folks' time here as well. But I just want to say thank you again to the professor for being super generous with her time, especially in this extremely busy cycle for her, even more so than usual. So thank you, Professor Blank, so much for joining and for providing your insight and for our students. Any final or closing words before we wrap up?
I don't think so. The only thing I would say is, read the news, because being aware of what's going on, what the debates are, is obviously really important if you're interested in, this doesn't have to be international law, anything, and you'll see as you study law that you're gonna start to see things in the news coverage that oh wait, that's a legal issue, that's interesting, I wonder why that's right or wrong. And it links what you're doing in the classroom to everyday life, which I know for me kind of adds a lot of interest, and sort of that connection I think is very helpful.
Yeah, excellent. No, that's fantastic, and I think one of the benefits of the JD for sure. Thank you all so much for taking the time. If you have any questions after today, again, please send me an email directly. Happy to provide any information and make any connections as well. Hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow for our session with the dean, and see you all on Friday. But hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you again to Professor Blank. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you all soon. But welcome to Emory, and have a great night.
Great, thanks.